Sometimes the smallest sentence in a quiet hallway ends up changing two lives forever. The words would come back to Daniel Carter weeks later, though at that moment he had no idea the night was about to carve itself into his memory. The mountain lodge sat high above the dark line of pine trees, snow drifting across the parking lot in slow white waves under the yellow glow of the lamps. It was nearly 10:40 p.m., and the storm had swallowed the last open road for miles. Inside the warm lobby, the receptionist stared at the computer screen a moment longer than usual, her brow tightening slightly before she looked up. Daniel stood at the counter with his hands loosely folded, his posture calm, his expression unreadable in the soft light. Behind him, Victoria Hale waited near the stone fireplace, scrolling through emails on her phone with the quiet impatience of someone used to problems solving themselves quickly. The receptionist cleared her throat. "I'm sorry," she said gently, glancing between them, "but the storm filled every room in town. There's only one left." The words hung in the air like the final note of a song. Daniel turned his head slowly toward Victoria. She lifted her eyes from her phone, meeting his gaze across the small lobby. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Victoria Hale was not the type of woman who shared hotel rooms with employees. She ran a company worth more than most of the buildings in the valley below. Her schedule ran on precision, and her world rarely included surprises. Yet outside, the snow continued to fall harder, thick flakes drifting sideways against the glass doors as the wind pushed through the mountain pass. Daniel looked back at the receptionist, then at the key card resting on the counter. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice steady and respectful, "there's only one room left." Victoria studied him carefully. Daniel Carter had worked for Hale Logistics for just over 7 months, driving executive routes and filling in wherever the schedule demanded. He was rarely the loudest person in a room, rarely the first to speak, and almost never the one asking for attention. Yet something about the way he stood there now, calm, composed, unbothered by the tension, made the moment feel strangely balanced. Victoria slipped her phone into her coat pocket. "What kind of room?" she asked. "Standard suite." The receptionist replied quickly. "One bed, small sofa." Daniel gave a small nod. "You can take the bed," he said simply. "I'll take the sofa." Victoria raised an eyebrow slightly. "You're deciding already?" "Just solving the problem," Daniel answered. Outside, the wind rattled softly against the window frames, and somewhere down the hall a heater hummed to life. Victoria watched him a second longer, as if trying to measure something she couldn't quite define. Most men around her either tried to impress her or tried to avoid her. Daniel did neither. He simply stood there, patient and steady, like someone who had already decided what kind of man he was long before tonight began. Finally, she reached forward and picked up the key card from the counter. "All right," she said calmly. "Let's see this room." The hallway outside the room was quiet except for the low hum of the heater pushing warm air through the vents. Daniel walked a step behind Victoria as they followed the narrow carpeted corridor, the key card held loosely between her fingers. The lodge had the kind of quiet that only appeared in mountain towns after a storm closed the roads. No laughter from the bar. No sound of luggage wheels rolling across the floor. Just the muffled whisper of snow piling against the windows somewhere beyond the wooden walls. When they reached the door marked 214, Victoria paused for a moment before sliding the card through the reader. A small green light blinked. The lock clicked open. She pushed the door slowly and stepped inside first. The room was simple, warm, and smaller than either of them expected. A queen bed stood against the far wall beneath a soft yellow lamp. A short sofa sat near the window beside a small wooden table. Snow swirled outside the glass like pale smoke drifting across the mountainside. Victoria took a few quiet steps into the room and set her phone on the table. Daniel remained near the doorway for a moment, as if measuring the space before stepping in and gently closing the door behind them. Neither of them spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable, but it carried a certain weight. Victoria removed her coat and folded it neatly over the back of the chair. Daniel walked to the window and glanced outside. The parking lot had already disappeared under several inches of fresh snow, and the wind continued pushing white waves across the asphalt. The storm had decided for them. No one was leaving tonight. Daniel turned back toward the room and looked at the small sofa. It was not large, but it was enough. He placed his bag on the floor beside it and rested his hands in his pockets. Victoria watched him for a moment with quiet curiosity. Most men around her either tried to impress her or tried to explain themselves. Daniel did neither. He simply moved through the room with calm efficiency, as if sharing space with a chief executive officer during a snowstorm was just another small detail in a long, ordinary day. Finally, Victoria spoke. "You do not seem surprised by this situation." Daniel shrugged slightly. Weather does not care about job titles. Victoria almost smiled but did not quite allow it to show. She walked to the bed and sat on the edge for a moment, listening to the storm outside. The wind brushed against the window glass in slow, restless waves. "You can still take the bed," she said suddenly. Daniel shook his head gently. "No, ma'am. The sofa is fine. You do not know that. I have slept in worse places." His voice carried no complaint, only quiet honesty. Victoria studied him again, trying to understand the calm that seemed to follow him everywhere. It was not arrogance. It was not submission. It was something steadier. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, glancing briefly at the time. It was just after 11. Somewhere hundreds of miles away, his daughter would already be asleep. For a moment his expression softened, though he said nothing. Victoria noticed the change, but did not ask about it yet. Instead, she leaned back slightly on the bed and looked toward the window where the snow continued to fall in patient silence. The storm had locked the world outside, and inside that small room, two people from entirely different lives now shared the same quiet night. Daniel set his phone down on the small wooden table beside the sofa and sat quietly for a moment, listening to the steady rhythm of the storm brushing against the lodge walls. The room had settled into a calm that felt almost suspended in time, the kind of quiet that happens when the outside world decides to pause. Victoria had moved to the window, standing with her arms lightly crossed as she looked out over the white landscape, where the parking lot lights glowed faintly through drifting snow. For several seconds neither of them spoke. The heater hummed softly near the wall vent, filling the room with warm air that carried the faint scent of pine from the lodge furniture. Finally, Daniel picked up his phone again and glanced at the screen, his thumb hovering there for a moment before he tapped a button and held the phone to his ear. The call rang only once before a small voice answered on the other end. "Daddy." The word carried the sleepy softness of a child who had been half asleep before the phone rang. Daniel smiled without realizing it. "Hey there, Pumpkin," he said gently. "Did I wake you up?" "A little," the girl replied with a quiet yawn. "Grandma said you were driving in the mountains tonight." Daniel leaned back slightly on the sofa, lowering his voice as if the room itself had become part of the conversation. "I was, but the snow got pretty heavy. I had to stop at a lodge until the road's clear." The girl on the other end of the phone seemed to think about that. "Are you sleeping in the truck again?" Daniel chuckled softly. "No, not tonight. I have a real room this time." Across the room, Victoria did not turn around, but she heard every word. The question had been innocent, yet something about it lingered in the air longer than expected. "That is good," the little girl said. "Because Grandma says people should rest when they are tired." Daniel nodded slowly, even though she could not see him. "Your grandma is usually right." "Did you eat dinner?" she asked. "I did." "Did you drink water?" "Yes." "Did you wear your warm jacket?" Daniel laughed quietly now. "Yes, ma'am, I did all of those things." The girl sounded satisfied with the answer. "Okay, good. I was worried." Daniel's expression softened again. "You do not need to worry about me. That is my job." The girl paused before asking one more question. "Are you coming home tomorrow?" Daniel looked briefly toward the snowstorm outside the window before answering. "As soon as the roads open." "Promise." "Promise." The call ended a moment later with the gentle sound of a child drifting back toward sleep. Daniel lowered the phone and placed it on the table again. For a few seconds he simply sat there, the quiet smile still resting on his face. Victoria remained near the window, though now her attention had shifted slightly away from the storm outside. She had spent years sitting in boardrooms with people twice as loud and half as genuine as the man sitting across the room. Yet the calm conversation she had just overheard felt more real than most of those meetings combined. She turned slightly, looking toward Daniel with a thoughtful expression that carried less distance than before. "Your daughter?" she asked quietly. Daniel nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." Victoria glanced toward the phone on the table. "She sounds like she takes her responsibilities seriously." Daniel smiled again. "She believes someone has to keep an eye on me." For the first time that evening, Victoria allowed a small, genuine smile to appear. Outside, the snow continued falling steadily. But inside the small room, something had shifted almost invisibly, like the first thin crack in a wall that had stood too long. Victoria remained near the window for several moments after Daniel finished speaking, the faint reflection of the room visible in the glass beside the falling snow. The lodge lights outside glowed softly against the storm, turning the drifting flakes into slow-moving clouds. For most of her life, silence like this had been rare. Her days were normally filled with voices, meetings, negotiations, numbers that never seemed to stop moving across screens. Yet tonight the quiet inside that small mountain room felt strangely steady, almost grounding. She turned slightly and walked back toward the center of the room, stopping beside the small table where Daniel had placed his phone. He was leaning back on the sofa now, his hands loosely folded, the calm expression returning to his face after the call with his daughter. Victoria studied him for a moment before speaking. "How old is she?" Daniel looked up. 8 years old. Victoria nodded slowly. "She sounds older than that." Daniel smiled faintly. "Responsibility tends to do that." Victoria sat down at the edge of the bed again, her posture relaxed in a way that would have surprised most of the people who worked for her. In the corporate offices back in Chicago, she rarely sat anywhere without purpose. Even her pauses carried strategy. But here there were no board members, no presentations, no investors waiting for answers. Just the quiet hum of the heater and the soft movement of the storm outside. "You travel a lot for work," she said after a moment. Daniel nodded. "Enough. That must be difficult with a child." Daniel considered the question before answering. "Sometimes. But she understands why I do it." Victoria looked toward the window again as the wind brushed lightly against the glass. "Most children would not understand something like that." Daniel shrugged gently. "Most children also do not remind their fathers to drink water and wear warm jackets." Victoria allowed herself another small smile. The moment passed quietly before curiosity slipped into her voice again. "Her mother helps with that?" Daniel's expression did not change much, but something in his eyes softened slightly. "Her mother passed away 3 years ago." The words were spoken without drama, without bitterness, simply as a fact that had long ago settled into the rhythm of his life. Victoria looked at him more carefully now. "I am sorry." Daniel nodded once. "Thank you." Neither of them spoke for a few seconds after that. The room remained peaceful, yet the air carried a deeper understanding now. Victoria had met thousands of people through her career, yet very few of them spoke about loss without either anger or performance. Daniel simply accepted it as part of the story that shaped him. Victoria folded her hands together and leaned back slightly on the bed. "And you have been raising her alone since then?" "Yes. While working full-time." Daniel nodded again. "That is usually how the bills get paid." Victoria looked at him thoughtfully, noticing how easily he said something that most people would turn into a long explanation. There was no complaint in his voice, no request for sympathy, just quiet truth. She glanced down at the floor for a moment before speaking again. "You seem very calm about everything." Daniel looked toward the window where the snow continued falling beyond the glass. "Children watch everything their parents do," he said slowly. "If I panic, she learns panic. If I stay steady, she learns steady." Victoria let that thought sit in the quiet room for several seconds. Outside, the storm continued covering the mountains in white, but inside the small lodge room the distance between two very different lives had begun to narrow in ways neither of them had expected. The quiet in the room lingered after Daniel's words, as if the idea itself had settled gently into the walls. "Children watch everything their parents do." The sentence seemed simple, but Victoria felt its weight more than she expected. She had spent years teaching thousands of employees how to perform under pressure, how to move fast, how to win in competitive markets. Yet she had never thought about the way calm itself could be taught like a language. She looked across the room at Daniel, who now sat slightly forward on the small sofa, his elbows resting lightly on his knees. Outside, the wind pressed against the lodge again, rattling the window for a brief moment before fading back into the steady hush of snowfall. Victoria folded her hands together and tilted her head slightly. "You make it sound simple," she said quietly. Daniel gave a small shrug. "It is not simple. It is just necessary." Victoria considered that answer. In the corporate world she lived in, people often used long explanations to hide simple truths. Daniel seemed to do the opposite. He used very few words, but the ones he chose carried clarity that felt difficult to argue with. She leaned back against the headboard of the bed and watched the slow movement of snow through the glass window. "My father used to say something similar," she said after a moment. Daniel glanced up. Victoria rarely mentioned her family in conversation, especially not with employees. "He believed people showed their real character when things became difficult," she continued. "Most of the time I thought he was just trying to make me stronger." Daniel nodded once. Maybe he was. Victoria allowed a faint breath of laughter. "He ran a small manufacturing company in Ohio. Nothing like the company I run now. But he always insisted that leadership had very little to do with the office and everything to do with the example." She paused briefly, looking toward the floor as if remembering something from many years ago. "I did not fully understand what he meant until much later." Daniel listened quietly, not interrupting. That alone made the conversation different from most she had during the day. Usually when she spoke, people rushed to respond before she had even finished a sentence. Daniel simply gave the space for her thoughts to unfold. After a few seconds, she looked back at him. "What made you decide to keep traveling for work instead of finding something closer to home?" Daniel thought about the question before answering. "Opportunity. Opportunity to move up in the company?" Victoria asked. Daniel shook his head gently. "Opportunity to give my daughter a stable life." Victoria studied his expression. The words were calm, but they carried a quiet determination she recognized immediately. The kind that did not need to announce itself. "Most people chase careers first," she said. Daniel smiled slightly. "Children have a way of rearranging priorities." The heater clicked softly as it adjusted the temperature in the room. Victoria noticed how relaxed the atmosphere had become compared to the tense silence earlier that night. The storm still controlled the world outside, but inside the room the conversation had grown easier, almost natural. She looked toward the small sofa again, noticing the thin blanket folded neatly over the armrest. "You are certain that sofa is comfortable enough?" she asked. Daniel glanced at it and smiled. "Compared to the front seat of a delivery truck during a snowstorm, this feels like a luxury suite." Victoria laughed quietly, the sound soft but genuine. It surprised even her. Daniel did not react with surprise. He simply smiled back, as if the moment itself did not need explanation. Outside, the snow continued falling in patient silence, and inside the room something deeper than conversation had begun to take shape between them. Not friendship yet, not trust fully formed, but the first quiet recognition that two people from very different worlds might still understand the same simple truths. The laughter faded gently, leaving behind the same calm silence that had slowly taken hold of the room. For a while neither of them spoke. The heater continued its low, steady hum, while the storm outside brushed snow against the windows in soft waves. Victoria shifted slightly on the bed, resting one hand against the wooden headboard as she listened to the quiet rhythm of the lodge. It had been years since she had spent a night anywhere without a schedule waiting for her in the morning. Even vacations usually came with phone calls and decisions that followed her across time zones. Tonight, however, the storm had removed all of that. No board members, no urgent messages, just the quiet presence of another human being sharing the same unexpected pause in the world. Daniel reached down and unfolded the thin blanket resting on the arm of the sofa. He draped it across his lap and leaned back again, his posture relaxed but alert in the way people become when they are used to adapting to unfamiliar spaces. Victoria watched him for a moment before speaking again. "Do you ever miss the life you had before becoming a father?" Daniel looked at the ceiling for a moment, as if searching through memories before answering. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity," he said, "but I do not miss the direction I lacked." Victoria tilted her head slightly. "What do you mean?" Daniel rested his hands together. "Before my daughter was born, I worked hard, but I did not always know why. I moved from job to job, chasing money without much thought about where it would lead." Victoria listened carefully. She had met many ambitious people who chased success with that same restless energy. And becoming a father changed that? Daniel nodded slowly. The moment she arrived, the path became clearer. Every decision had a purpose. Victoria leaned back further against the pillows, letting the idea settle into her mind. Purpose was a word she understood well, but hearing it spoken in such a quiet, personal way made it feel different from the corporate speeches she often delivered. "You make it sound like she saved you," she said softly. Daniel smiled a little. Children have a way of doing that without realizing it. The storm outside strengthened briefly, sending a swirl of snow across the window that blurred the lights of the parking lot beyond. Victoria watched the shifting white shapes and suddenly felt a strange tightness in her chest. It was not pain exactly, but something closer to pressure, like the body remembering stress even after the mind had slowed down. She took a slow breath, then another, but the tightness remained. Daniel noticed the change almost immediately. He sat forward slightly, his voice calm. "Are you all right?" Victoria waved one hand gently, as if dismissing the concern. "Just tired," she said. But her breathing had grown shallow without her noticing. Years of constant work and late nights had trained her body to ignore exhaustion until it forced its way to the surface. Daniel stood slowly, careful not to move too quickly. "Sometimes when people finally stop moving," he said quietly, "their body realizes how much it has been holding." Victoria placed one hand against her chest, focusing on her breathing. Daniel remained several feet away, giving her space, his voice steady and unhurried. "Try something simple," he said. "Breathe in slowly through your nose. Then let it out slowly through your mouth." Victoria followed the rhythm without arguing, her breaths gradually slowing as the tension eased. The room remained quiet except for the soft whisper of wind outside and the calm guidance of Daniel's voice. After several moments, the tightness faded and her breathing returned to normal. Victoria exhaled one final time and looked at him with quiet surprise. "You sound like a doctor." Daniel shook his head gently. "No, ma'am. Just a father who has calmed a few nightmares in the middle of the night." Victoria sat there for a moment, absorbing the simplicity of that answer. Outside, the storm continued its steady fall, but inside the small room, the quiet patience of a single moment had changed the atmosphere once again. Victoria remained seated on the bed for a few moments after her breathing returned to normal, her hands resting quietly in her lap, while the warmth of the room slowly replaced the tension that had filled her chest. The storm outside had softened again, the wind easing into a steady fall of snow that drifted past the window like slow-moving feathers. Daniel had returned to the sofa without making any comment about what had just happened. He simply sat down again, folding the thin blanket over his legs with the same calm patience he had shown all evening. That quiet restraint caught Victoria's attention more than any dramatic reaction could have. Most people in her world would have rushed to ask questions, to offer advice, or to turn the moment into something larger than it was. Daniel had done none of that. He had simply helped, then stepped back. After a minute, Victoria spoke again, her voice softer than before. "You handled that very calmly." Daniel glanced up briefly. It was not a crisis. Victoria raised an eyebrow slightly. "My board of directors would disagree. They believe any unexpected event is a crisis." Daniel smiled faintly. "Your board of directors probably does not spend much time calming 8-year-olds after midnight." Victoria let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like another laugh. She leaned back slightly, her shoulders relaxing against the pillows. "You may be right about that." The room settled into another peaceful silence, but this time it felt different. The tension that had separated them earlier in the evening had faded into something closer to mutual ease. Victoria watched Daniel for a moment as he adjusted the blanket on the sofa. "You did not panic when I struggled to breathe," she said. "Why?" Daniel considered the question carefully before answering. "Because panic spreads." Victoria looked at him with curiosity. "Explain that." Daniel rested his hands together. "When one person loses control of a moment, the people around them often lose control as well, especially children." Victoria nodded slowly as the meaning settled in. "So you stay calm for your daughter?" Daniel nodded once. "Yes." Victoria tilted her head slightly. "And you stayed calm for me tonight?" Daniel did not respond immediately. He looked toward the window for a moment before speaking again. "Anyone deserves calm when they are trying to breathe." Victoria looked down at her hands, absorbing the simplicity of the statement. For years she had built a reputation for strength, decisiveness, and control. Yet the calm support she had just received from a man who worked for her felt more grounding than many of the professional advisors she had hired over the years. She lifted her eyes toward him again. "You are not intimidated by me, are you?" Daniel shook his head gently. "No, ma'am." Victoria studied him carefully. "Most people are." Daniel shrugged slightly. "Power can make people nervous. But not you." Daniel leaned back against the sofa cushion. "Being a father changes what feels intimidating." Victoria frowned slightly, intrigued. How so? Daniel smiled faintly, the kind of smile that appeared when someone had already solved the puzzle they were describing. When you are responsible for a child who depends on you every day, boardrooms and job titles begin to look a little smaller. Victoria stared at him for a moment before letting out a quiet breath. The sentence carried more truth than she expected. Outside, the snow continued drifting down the mountainside, covering the roads and trees in white silence. Inside the lodge room, the distance between employer and employee had slowly faded into something far more human. And though neither of them said it out loud, both understood that the night had already begun to change. The way they saw each other. The room grew quieter as the night deepened, the storm outside settling into a slow, steady snowfall that covered the mountains in soft white silence. The heater clicked gently once before continuing its low hum, and for a while neither Daniel nor Victoria spoke. The conversation they had shared seemed to linger in the air like a thought neither of them wanted to interrupt. Victoria shifted slightly against the pillows and looked toward the window again. The parking lot lights glowed faintly through the snow, casting long reflections across the glass. It felt strange to sit in such stillness without a schedule waiting for her attention. For years her nights had ended with reports, messages, or strategy calls that stretched long past midnight. Yet tonight there was nothing demanding her focus except the quiet moment itself. Daniel sat comfortably on the sofa with the blanket resting across his legs, his posture relaxed but attentive in the quiet way of someone used to listening more than speaking. Victoria glanced toward him again. "Do you ever think about where your life might have gone if things had turned out differently?" she asked after a moment. Daniel considered the question before answering. "Sometimes." Victoria tilted her head slightly. "And what do you imagine?" Daniel looked toward the ceiling as if tracing an invisible map of choices. "I imagine I might have kept chasing work without understanding why." Victoria watched him carefully. "But you understand now." Daniel nodded slowly. "Now I know the direction." Victoria sat quietly with that thought for a moment. The calm certainty in his voice carried a kind of clarity she rarely heard in business conversations. In boardrooms, people spoke constantly about direction, growth, and ambition, yet very few of them seemed as grounded as the man sitting across the room from her. She leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees. "Earlier you said children rearrange priorities," she said. "I think that may be the most honest leadership philosophy I have heard in years." Daniel smiled faintly. "It is not much of a philosophy." Victoria shook her head gently. "You would be surprised." She paused briefly before continuing. "In my world, people often chase power without asking what it is supposed to serve." Daniel listened without interrupting. "But watching you tonight," she continued quietly, "I see someone whose life already has its purpose decided." Daniel looked down at his hands for a moment before speaking. "Purpose is easier to find when someone small is watching everything you do." Victoria let out a slow breath and leaned back again. The room remained peaceful as the snow continued drifting down outside. For the first time in a long while she felt a kind of quiet reflection settling over her thoughts. Years of building a company had taught her how to measure success in numbers and growth charts. But Daniel had spoken about purpose in a way that did not involve profit or expansion at all. She looked toward him again with thoughtful curiosity. "When the roads open tomorrow morning," she said softly, "what will be the first thing you do?" Daniel did not hesitate. "Call my daughter and tell her I am on the way home." Victoria smiled gently at the answer. Outside, the storm continued to fade into the night, and inside the small lodge room the calm understanding between them had grown deeper than either of them expected when the evening began. Morning arrived quietly over the mountains, the storm having softened sometime before dawn. Pale winter light slipped through the thin curtains and spread across the small room in gentle shades of gray and gold. Outside the window the world had transformed overnight. Pine trees stood heavy with snow, the parking lot buried beneath several fresh inches that glistened under the rising sun. For a moment the room remained perfectly still. Daniel was the first to stir. Years of early mornings had trained his body to wake before the alarm clock ever needed to ring. He opened his eyes slowly and sat up on the sofa, the blanket still resting across his legs. The lodge was silent except for the faint hum of the heater and the distant sound of someone shoveling snow outside. Daniel stretched slightly and glanced toward the window, noticing the clear sky that had replaced the storm. The roads would open soon. He reached for his phone on the small table and checked the time. 6:20 in the morning. Back home his daughter would just be waking up for school. Daniel smiled faintly as he imagined her small feet crossing the kitchen floor while her grandmother prepared breakfast. Across the room Victoria remained asleep for a few moments longer, the quiet calm of the night still resting on her expression. The tension she carried the evening before had faded completely, replaced by the deep rest that rarely found her during normal workdays. Eventually the soft movement of Daniel standing caught her attention. She opened her eyes slowly and looked around the room as if remembering where she was. The sunlight near the window made the snow outside glow softly. Victoria sat up and brushed a strand of hair back from her face. "Good morning," she said quietly. Daniel nodded politely. "Good morning, ma'am." Victoria glanced toward the window and noticed the clear sky. "Looks like the storm moved on." Daniel walked to the window and looked out over the bright snow-covered landscape. "Yes, ma'am. The roads should be open soon." Victoria stepped out of the bed and walked beside him, looking out across the peaceful mountains. The silence between them felt different now, no longer uncertain, but calm and familiar. For a few moments, they simply stood there watching the morning light spread across the valley below. Finally, Victoria turned slightly toward him. "You were right about something last night," she said. Daniel looked at her curiously. "What is that?" Victoria folded her arms lightly and smiled in a thoughtful way. "Children really do rearrange priorities." Daniel smiled gently. "They tend to remind us what matters." Victoria nodded slowly, her eyes drifting back toward the quiet mountains. For years, she had measured progress through quarterly reports and expansion charts. Yet the simple clarity Daniel carried with him had revealed something she had not expected to learn during a snowstorm in a small lodge room. She turned back toward him once more. "When we return to the office," she said calmly, "I think I have a few things to reconsider." Daniel did not ask what she meant. He simply nodded, accepting the moment without curiosity or pressure. Outside, the first vehicles began slowly moving along the freshly cleared road below the lodge. The world was beginning to move again. Daniel picked up his phone and glanced at the screen before slipping it into his jacket pocket. "My daughter will be leaving for school soon," he said quietly. Victoria smiled softly. "Then we should not keep her father waiting." Together they gathered their things and prepared to leave the small room that had unexpectedly paused both of their lives for a single winter night. And though neither of them said it out loud, both understood that the calm conversation shared between falling snow and quiet morning light would follow them long after the mountains disappeared behind them.